Sarah Johnson stood at the entrance of St. Luke's General Hospital, clutching her medical bag while trying to suppress the anxiety churning in her stomach. This wasn't her first time in a hospital, nor her first time facing challenges, but there was something different about this new job. From the moment she received the offer, she knew it wouldn't be easy. She walked into the hospital and went straight to the nurses' station, where she found a group of colleagues talking. The chatter abruptly stopped the moment Sarah entered. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, the head nurse, Marta, a woman with a stern expression, and 3 other white nurses exchanging glances among themselves. "Oh, you must be Sarah Johnson," Marta said, looking Sarah up and down with a neutral expression. "I'll show you where your patients are. You'll be in charge of Ward 4. Marta pointed down the hallway, not offering a smile. Without further conversation, Sarah followed down the corridor, her heart pounding. Ward 4 was one of the hospital's most challenging sections, known for housing the most critical patients. Sarah wondered if the decision to place her there was made because of her experience or if this was some kind of test. She took a deep breath, recalling her mother's words, "You'll have to be twice as good as the others to be seen as their equal." As soon as she reached the ward, a doctor rushed past her without even lifting his eyes. She overheard hushed comments from some nurses in the distance, with remarks like, "She's lucky to have gotten that job," and "Let's see how long she lasts." Sarah pretended not to hear, but the sting of those words cut deep. Despite the difficulties, Sarah held her head high and focused on her first task of the day. When she entered a patient's room, she glanced at the chart. John Miller, middle-aged, no major medical complications, but with a history of prolonged treatments. He was lying in bed, reading a newspaper. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. I'm Sarah, your nurse. How are you feeling today?" she asked, forcing a smile, trying to push aside the hostility she had encountered so far. John lifted his eyes from the newspaper and stared at her for a long moment, as if assessing something far beyond her words. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a slight nod and responded. "I'm fine, thank you. Just observing how things work around here." Sarah didn't quite know how to interpret that response. There was something about John that seemed different from the other patients. He didn't ask trivial questions, didn't complain about pain or discomfort, he just observed. His eyes followed her every movement around the room, attentive. After finishing the routine exams, Sarah left John's room with the distinct feeling that he knew more than he let on. What did he mean by observing how things work around here? Back in the hallway, she ran into Marta again. "Johnson, I need you to cover the night shift as well. The nurse who was supposed to come in is sick," Marta said bluntly, throwing yet another responsibility on her shoulders. "Of course, I can cover, but," Sarah began to ask if she could at least have a break, but Marta had already walked off, completely ignoring her. The night shift brought even more challenges. The hospital was understaffed, and Sarah barely had 5 minutes to sit down. Her co-workers on the shift didn't give her much space to socialize, and whenever she asked for help, she received short answers or disdainful looks. It was as if she wasn't even there, invisible. After hours of exhausting work, Sarah finally found herself alone in an empty break room. She sighed, sinking into a chair, feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders. "Is it always going to be like this?" she thought, as she stared at the clock on the wall. 3 more hours to go. Suddenly, the door opened, and John Miller entered, the same patient from that morning. "Mr. Miller. What are you doing out of your room at this hour?" Sarah stood up, surprised. "I needed some air," he said calmly. "And I thought I'd check on the new nurse that everyone's been talking about." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. Everyone's been talking about. It was impossible to ignore the insinuation. Had John overheard the comments? He stepped closer, and before she could ask anything, he spoke in an enigmatic tone. What you're facing here is nothing new to me. I've seen it happen many times before. Don't let it break you, Sarah. She stood there in silence, unsure how to respond. There was something in John's eyes, full of wisdom and mystery, as if he knew exactly what she was going through. He turned to leave, leaving Sarah's mind racing with unanswered questions. Who was John Miller, and why did he seem so aware of everything happening around her? More importantly, why did he seem so interested in her situation? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the intercom calling her name. Another patient needed care. It was time to get back to work, but John's words echoed in her mind. This wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was a much bigger battle than Sarah had imagined. She knew she would need to be stronger than ever. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital, feeling the weight of the previous night's exhaustion. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed the few hours of sleep she'd managed, but she kept her posture firm. As she walked down the hallway, trying to ignore the suspicious looks from some colleagues, the conversation with John Miller played over and over in her head. His words had a mysterious tone that she still couldn't fully grasp. Who was this man? And what did he know about her situation in the hospital? When she opened the door to John's room, she found him exactly the same way as the day before, calm, sitting in bed, with a newspaper in his hands. He looked at her as soon as she entered, and for a brief moment, his eyes seemed to read more than she was willing to reveal. Determined to maintain her professionalism, Sarah approached him and began her routine checkup. "Did you sleep well, Mr. Miller?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "How can anyone sleep in a place like this?" he replied with a slight smile. "But I survived, and that's what matters." Sarah smiled politely, but couldn't shake the growing discomfort. There was something about the way John spoke that made it seem like he knew more about the hospital than he should. While adjusting the equipment around the bed, John suddenly made a comment. "I've witnessed a lot in places like this, Sarah. And what I'm seeing here is no different." She paused for a moment, trying to decipher what he was hinting at. Places like this? Witnessed what? Before she could ask, John continued. "You're a smart woman, Sarah. And an excellent professional, from what I've seen. But, of course, that's not enough, is it?" Those words hit Sarah hard. John was clearly referring to the discrimination she had been facing. She hadn't shared that with anyone, yet somehow, John knew. She hesitated for a moment but decided she couldn't let it pass. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. "What exactly do you mean?" John set the newspaper aside and looked at her with a serious expression, without his usual lightness. His face reflected someone who had fought similar battles. He wasn't just any patient, and Sarah was starting to realize that. "Because I know what it's like to be underestimated," he said calmly. "I know what it's like to be in an environment where people think you don't belong. And I know you're dealing with that right now." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He had hit the nail on the head, exactly describing what she had been experiencing since her first day at St. Luke's. But how? How did he know so much about her? "I don't know what you're talking about," she tried to deflect, returning to the equipment. "Yes, you do," he replied, with a subtle smile. "But don't worry. That's going to change." "Change?" Sarah frowned. "What do you mean by that?" John didn't respond immediately. He just watched her for a few more seconds, as if carefully considering his next words. The people running this hospital, they think they're in control. They think they can treat people however they want. But, in reality, they have no control at all, John said, his voice serene but carrying a weight that Sarah couldn't ignore. Sarah was about to question him further when the door suddenly opened. Dr. Harris, the senior doctor in charge of the ward, entered with his usual air of superiority. He barely glanced at Sarah as he made his way directly to John. "How's our patient today?" Dr. Harris asked, completely ignoring Sarah's presence as he flipped through John's chart. "I'm doing just fine, thank you," John replied, but there was a hint of sarcasm in his tone that didn't escape Sarah's notice. Dr. Harris forced a smile and gave Sarah just enough of a glance to bark an order. "Sarah, I need you to prepare everything for his routine tests now. And then cover the extra shift in Ward 2, they're short-staffed." Sarah's irritation grew. Once again, she was the one getting the hardest tasks, while the other nurses were barely bothered. Nevertheless, she nodded and started preparing what was needed. Dr. Harris left the room without even looking back at her. As soon as the door closed, John let out a low chuckle, as if he found the situation amusing. "He really doesn't see what's right in front of him, does he?" John remarked, fiddling with the newspaper, but there was a glint of something more in his eyes. "What does that mean?" Sarah couldn't hold back. She was exhausted from the half-truths and insinuations. John leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms over his chest. His face took on an enigmatic, almost challenging expression. "It means that soon, those in control will realize that real power isn't in their hands. And you, Sarah, you're going to be a key part of all this." Sarah's mind raced. It sounded like a premonition, something far beyond what a regular patient would be entitled to know. Who was John Miller, really? Before she could ask more questions, Marta's voice came through the intercom, calling her to Ward 2, cutting off any chance to continue the conversation. Sarah left John's room even more intrigued. Every word he spoke seemed to carry a hidden meaning. She knew he wasn't just another patient, but what exactly was he hinting at with those cryptic messages? And why was he so interested in her struggle at the hospital? As she walked through the hallways to answer the next call, something in her intuition told her that John Miller still had much to reveal, and that, somehow, he might be the key to the change she so desperately wanted, not just for herself but for St. Luke's General Hospital. Sarah walked through the crowded hospital corridors, the sounds of heart monitors and intercom calls filling the air. Although she was moving, her mind was elsewhere, stuck on John Miller's mysterious words. "You're going to be a key part of all this." Those words echoed in her head. What did he mean by that? And why did she, specifically, seem to be at the center of something she still couldn't fully grasp? Though confused, Sarah knew she couldn't let these questions distract her. St. Luke's General Hospital was an unforgiving environment, and any sign of weakness could be used against her. As she passed by one of the ward windows, she looked outside at the bustling city and found herself thinking of her mother. "You'll have to be twice as good as the others to be considered half as competent," Sarah, her mother, Catherine Johnson, used to say. Catherine was a strong woman who had faced similar battles in her time. She was a retired nurse and had always made it clear that life would never be easy for Sarah. From a young age, Sarah had known her path would be harder simply because of the color of her skin. Sitting in the break room for a moment, Sarah closed her eyes and let the memories flow. The image of her mother came vividly to her mind, especially the day Sarah decided to follow in her footsteps and become a nurse. Catherine had always emphasized the importance of resilience, discipline, and, above all, the courage to face prejudice and discrimination head-on. Catherine often repeated a phrase that Sarah kept engraved in her heart: when they try to bring you down, you'll show them what you're made of. They'll underestimate you, they'll ignore you, but you'll get back up. Always. Sarah opened her eyes, feeling a bit stronger. It was as if her mother was right there, guiding her, helping her navigate the hostile environment. Throughout her career, Sarah had always kept that advice close. She knew that as a black woman, she would face obstacles her white colleagues could never even imagine. But that had never stopped her. She was one of the top students in her nursing class, always determined to prove that she was more than capable of doing her job with excellence. However, St. Luke's was a different kind of test. Here, the prejudice was right out in the open. It wasn't just malicious glances or hushed comments. There was an atmosphere of exclusion that constantly weighed on her, making each day more difficult than the last. Sarah wondered how much longer she could endure, but giving up was never an option. Remembering her mother's words gave her the strength to keep going. As she checked the clock and prepared to return to her ward, an alert came over the PA system. There was a critical patient in Ward 4, the ward she was in charge of. Sarah raced down the corridors, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the hospital's cold walls. When she reached the room, the situation was chaotic. The medical team was already gathered around George Davis, a patient Sarah knew well. He was a bitter, openly racist man who had refused to be treated by Sarah in the past, stating he didn't want to be touched by someone like her. But now, George was fighting for his life. "Nurse Johnson, we need to stabilize him," Dr. Harris shouted, for the first time seeming willing to ask for her help. Sarah ignored the past and threw herself into the situation, acting quickly and precisely. Despite the provocations George had made days earlier, Sarah knew her duty was to save lives, regardless of who the patient was. She worked tirelessly, giving clear instructions to the other team members and taking control of the situation. Dr. Harris, though reluctant, had to admit that she knew exactly what she was doing. After a successful emergency intervention, the team managed to stabilize George. He was out of immediate danger, though still unconscious. Sweat dripped down Sarah's forehead, but she stayed focused. She couldn't afford to feel relief just yet. As she stepped out of the room to catch her breath, she overheard some of the younger nurses whispering nearby. "She actually saved that old racist," one of them remarked, incredulously. "Yeah, I would have let him fend for himself," another replied, laughing. Sarah didn't respond. Not because she agreed, but because she knew that any reaction could be used against her. Instead, she simply moved on, her focus still on her work, as always. Later, while reviewing reports at the nursing station, Sarah sensed a presence beside her. It was Marta, the head nurse. Her face was as stern as ever, but there was something different in her eyes. "You did well today, Johnson," she said, in a tone that almost sounded like a compliment. "I didn't expect anything less from someone with your background." Sarah felt a mixture of surprise and frustration. Marta acknowledged her competence, but it came across as if it were an exception, as if it was surprising that she, a black woman, could be so skilled. Instead of responding, Sarah simply nodded and returned to her work. She knew her path there was still far from easy. At the end of her shift, Sarah ran into John Miller again. He seemed more attentive than usual, as if he'd been waiting for something. "Looks like you passed a test today, Sarah," he commented, with that enigmatic smile that was starting to both irritate and intrigue her. "Did you know what was going to happen?" she asked, bluntly. John chuckled softly, as if the answer was obvious. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew you were ready for anything. And that's the difference between you and the others. They don't expect anything from you, Sarah. But I see who you are. And soon, so will they. What do you mean by that? Sarah was tired of the evasive answers, but John simply smiled again and shrugged. All in good time. Keep doing what you do best. Once again, Sarah left his room filled with unanswered questions. John Miller knew something she didn't. He seemed to be one step ahead of everything, as if he could foresee what was coming. And somehow, Sarah felt that he wasn't just talking about her professional skills. There was something more, something that had yet to be revealed. The next morning, Sarah dragged herself to St. Luke's General Hospital, feeling the weight of the last 48 hours. Despite all her effort and dedication, the hostility in the environment remained relentless. She knew that her competence was being questioned, not because she lacked skill, but because of something beyond her control, her skin color. And now, it seemed like the challenges were only going to get worse. When she entered the nurses' station, she found Marta, the head nurse, along with a few other colleagues. As soon as Sarah approached, the group dispersed, except for Marta, who was waiting for her with an impassive look. Johnson, I need you to cover the palliative care ward today, Marta said bluntly. Sarah frowned. Palliative care. That ward was notoriously difficult, requiring not only medical expertise but also immense emotional resilience. It was the kind of responsibility usually given to nurses with more experience or seniority. Nevertheless, she nodded without protest. Of course, I'll head there now, Sarah replied, swallowing her frustration. As she made her way to the new ward, she saw some of her colleagues leaving the break room, laughing and chatting carelessly. They were assigned to what they called light shifts, dealing with recovering patients or administrative tasks. The contrast was evident. While Sarah was being pushed into the toughest areas, her white colleagues enjoyed a much easier and more comfortable environment. In the palliative care ward, Sarah was greeted by the strong smell of medication and an oppressive silence. Terminal patients filled the floor, their beds lined up as a cruel reminder that for many, this hospital would be their final stop. Sarah took a deep breath and began her work. Despite everything, she always maintained her professional integrity. If she had been assigned a task, she would do her best. The day was long and emotionally draining. Each patient had a story, a life they were clinging to desperately. Many were alone, with few visitors or absent family members. Sarah did what she could to comfort them, knowing that for them, her presence was more than just medical care. Deep down, she knew this kind of work wasn't for everyone, it wasn't just technical, it was deeply human. While Sarah was busy with an elderly patient, one of her colleagues, Rebecca, appeared in the doorway with a sarcastic smile on her face. How's it going, Johnson? Enjoying the new ward? Rebecca said, the sarcasm clear in her voice. I heard they only put the best here. Guess it's an honor, huh? Sarah took a deep breath, trying to control her anger. Rebecca had always made a point of treating her as inferior, masking her prejudice with fake politeness. Without acknowledging the provocation, Sarah responded with a simple, thank you, and went back to her work. Deep down, she knew the toughest tasks weren't just about testing her skills. It was a way to see if she would break. After hours of intense work, Sarah finally managed to take a brief break. As she sat in the break room, she noticed that her workload was disproportionate. Not only had she been sent to the most challenging ward, but she also had twice as many patients as her colleagues. Each of them seemed comfortable, laughing and socializing while Sarah could barely catch her breath. She picked up the phone and thought about calling her mother, Catherine. The mere sound of her mother's voice always brought her comfort, reminding her that she wasn't alone. But before she could make the call, she heard Marta's voice over the intercom. "Johnson, we need you in Ward 2. One of the doctors requested urgent assistance." Marta's voice was as cold as ever. Sarah barely had time to catch her breath before being called to another challenge. She got up and went to Ward 2, where she found Dr. Harris, who looked at her with that usual mix of arrogance and expectation. He was clearly waiting for her to make a mistake. And Sarah knew it. "Here you go, Johnson. Let's see if you can handle this." Dr. Harris handed her a patient's chart and walked away without further explanation. She opened the document and read the patient's file. George Davis, the same man who had openly expressed his racism the previous night. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. He was stable after the emergency the night before, but it was evident that Dr. Harris was testing her again, assigning her the most difficult task of the shift. When Sarah entered George's room, he looked at her with disdain. Even after she had saved his life, the man didn't respect her. In fact, his gaze seemed filled with even more contempt. "I said I didn't want you attending to me," George said firmly, his voice full of prejudice. "I am the nurse assigned to your case, Mr. Davis," Sarah replied calmly, maintaining her composure. "I don't care who put you here," he spat. "I don't want you in my room." George's words were like knives, but Sarah didn't allow him to see their effect on her. She continued her work, checking his vital signs and noting the necessary information. He insulted her the entire time, but she remained silent, focused on the task at hand. There was something profoundly cruel about being attacked so personally while trying to save someone's life. However, Sarah knew that George's prejudice wasn't about her, it was about him. And she would not allow it to break her. When she finished, she left the room, the tension in her shoulders almost unbearable. On her way out, she crossed paths with Dr. Harris again, watching her from afar. His gaze held a veiled satisfaction, as if he was waiting for Sarah to crumble at any moment. But that wasn't going to happen. Later, at the end of her shift, Sarah ran into John Miller again in the hallway. He was standing there, as if he had been waiting for her. His eyes seemed to shine with some kind of silent understanding. "Rough day, huh?" he asked, with that tone that always seemed to carry a hidden layer of meaning. "You have no idea," Sarah replied, unable to hide her exhaustion. John looked at her with an unusual intensity. "I know more than you think," he said, stepping forward. "But I told you, Sarah, things are going to change. And you're going to be a big part of it." "What do you mean? Why do you keep saying that?" Sarah asked, frustrated. "Who are you, really?" John smiled, but this time there was something more in his expression. Something that suggested the answers Sarah had been searching for were closer than she realized. "Don't worry. Soon, you'll understand everything." With that, John turned and walked down the corridor, leaving Sarah alone, still full of questions, but with a new sense that something big was about to happen. The next morning, the hospital seemed quieter than usual, as if the tension Sarah felt was spreading through the hallways. As she passed by the reception, she noticed a few colleagues glancing at her furtively, whispering to each other, but she stayed focused. After the past few days, she knew that nothing she said or did would change the way she was being treated. It was time to concentrate solely on her work. In the critical care ward, Sarah checked the patient list, and as expected, George Davis was among them. She already knew what to expect. George had made it undeniably clear that he despised her, both for her skin color and her presence in the hospital. Sarah tried not to think too much about it, but it was impossible to ignore. She knew that another attack could come at any moment. As soon as she entered the room, the air felt heavier. George was sitting up in bed, his face filled with rage and contempt. His eyes followed Sarah's every movement, as if he were waiting for the right moment to verbally assault her. Sarah, on the other hand, maintained her firm posture and continued monitoring his vital signs, staying calm. Suddenly, he broke the silence with a cold, venomous voice. "I already told you, I don't want you attending to me. I demanded another nurse, and yet they still send you. How is it possible that no one listens to me in this hospital?" Sarah took a deep breath, keeping her focus on her work. "I am the nurse responsible for your care, Mr. Davis. I'm here to ensure that you receive the best treatment possible," she said, maintaining her calm professionalism, even as the tension in the room grew thicker. George couldn't contain himself. His face turned red with anger, and he started yelling. "The best treatment? The best treatment would be not having you here. People like you shouldn't be anywhere, much less taking care of me." His voice was filled with hatred, and his words cut like knives. Sarah froze for a second, feeling the weight of his words, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. She knew this was exactly what George wanted, for her to lose control, to react emotionally so he could validate his prejudiced point of view. But Sarah was stronger than that. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Nevertheless, George's attack continued, becoming more aggressive. "I should sue this hospital for letting someone like you touch me. You're not capable, you're not worthy. I demand another nurse, right now," he shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. Sarah finished adjusting the equipment and, with a firm but controlled voice, replied. "I understand that you're frustrated, Mr. Davis, but I'm here to ensure that your health is taken care of. If you need anything else, I'll be available." She turned to leave the room, but before she could reach the door, she heard George mutter in a voice filled with disdain. "I'll never let a black woman take care of me. Never." Sarah stopped, her heart pounding. Those words were a direct, raw, undeniable attack. She felt the tears well up in her eyes but quickly blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. This was the moment her mother had always talked about, the moment when they would try to bring her down. She knew George was trying to unsettle her, and she knew the eyes of everyone in the hospital were on her, waiting for her reaction. Taking a deep breath, she walked out of the room without looking back. When she reached the break room, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. Her head throbbed with the intensity of the humiliation she had just endured. George's racism was something she had encountered before, but never with such intensity and in front of so many witnesses. Worse yet, she knew that his behavior would go unpunished. She was the only one who would be judged if she reacted. As she tried to pull herself together, Dr. Harris entered the room, his expression casual, as if what had just happened didn't matter. "Johnson, I heard what happened with Mr. Davis," he said, his tone almost indifferent. "I understand it's a difficult situation, but you need to keep your composure. We don't want any problems for the hospital, right?" Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Not only did she have to deal with a patient's racist attack, but now she had to listen to someone telling her to keep her composure, to protect the hospital's reputation. She took a deep breath, maintaining her calm, but her voice was firm. "Dr. Harris, with all due respect, Mr. Davis's behavior was unacceptable. No professional should be treated that way, regardless of who the patient is. Dr. Harris looked at her for a few seconds, as if considering her words, then shrugged as if it wasn't important. "I'll arrange for another nurse to take over his care from now on." He turned to leave the room, but before walking out, he threw another task at her. "But we need you to cover the emergency ward tonight. They're short-staffed." Sarah clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the injustice fall on her again. Even after everything she had just gone through, she was still the one being sent to cover the toughest night shift. She was the one who had to keep proving her worth. At that moment, the door opened again, and John Miller appeared, as casual as ever, but with his eyes fixed on Sarah. He seemed to know what had happened, as if he was always watching, observing. "I think I heard some noise earlier." "Is everything all right?" he asked, with a disconcerting calm. Sarah shook her head, trying to ignore the whirlwind of emotions she felt. "I don't even know what 'all right' means anymore, Mr. Miller. Things aren't exactly going in my favor," she said, with a tired sigh. John watched her for a moment, his eyes analyzing her every movement. Then, in a low and steady voice, he said, "You've endured more than anyone else in this hospital. And I told you, Sarah, this is going to change. Soon." She frowned, trying to understand what he was hinting at. "What do you know that I don't? Why do you keep saying that?" The frustration in her voice was evident. John smiled slightly, but there was a mystery behind his eyes, something that Sarah still couldn't decipher. "Because, Sarah, the people on top today might not be there tomorrow. Things change. People change. And you're going to be part of that change, whether you're ready or not." Before Sarah could respond, John gave a small nod and left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As mysterious as John was, something about his words was starting to feel real to Sarah. Something was about to happen, something big. And although she couldn't yet see the full picture, a part of her was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change for the better. That night, Sarah was exhausted. The workload in the emergency ward had been brutal, with critical cases coming in one after another, and her mind was still stuck on the events of the day. She was trying to process George Davis's blatant racism, the disdain from her colleagues, and John Miller's cryptic words. It was as if a storm was brewing around her, but somehow, she still couldn't see the epicenter. Deep down, something told her that John knew much more than he was letting on, and this feeling only heightened her anxiety. When her shift finally ended, Sarah passed by the reception area and noticed something unusual. There was a group of doctors, including Dr. Harris and other hospital board members, engaged in a heated discussion. Marta, the head nurse, stood in the middle of the conversation, her expression hard and severe, but Sarah couldn't make out what was going on. Curious, but too tired to get involved, she decided to head toward the break room and finally catch her breath. However, when she opened the door to the break room, she found John Miller standing there as if he'd been waiting for her. "I was expecting to find you here," he said, with a smile that didn't quite match the exhaustion visible in Sarah's eyes. Sarah stared at him, out of patience for more riddles or mysteries. "Mr. Miller, I don't know what you want, but after everything that happened today, I honestly don't have the energy for more games," she said, her voice heavy with frustration. John crossed his arms and observed her for a few moments. Silence stretched between them, and Sarah felt a mix of impatience and curiosity. Finally, John spoke. "I think it's time you knew who I really am and why I'm here." He stepped closer slowly, his words carrying an unexpected calm. I'm not just a regular patient, Sarah. In fact, my presence here was planned from the start. Sarah frowned, confused. His words didn't make any sense. What do you mean by that? She asked, her voice low but thick with anxiety. John sighed softly, as if gathering his thoughts. Then, he looked directly into her eyes. I am John Miller, CEO of one of the largest healthcare organizations in the country. And I'm also one of the main investors in this hospital, he said, slowly, letting each word settle in Sarah's mind. Sarah was in shock, her eyes widening as she processed the information. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. John, the seemingly ordinary patient she had been caring for, was, in fact, a powerful figure in the healthcare sector, with direct influence over St. Luke's. Her heart raced as she realized the magnitude of what that meant. You own this hospital?" Sarah asked, still trying to absorb the revelation. "Technically, I'm one of the major shareholders, but yes, I have a lot of control over what happens here," John replied, with a slight smile. "And that's exactly why I'm here." Sarah didn't know what to say. The revelation took her completely by surprise, and John's words were starting to make sense. He knew everything that was going on, knew how she was being treated, knew about the toxic culture that plagued the hospital. He wasn't just an observer, he had the power to change things. "So why didn't you do something sooner?" Sarah finally asked, her voice full of frustration. "Why did you let me go through all of this?" John looked at her with a mixture of seriousness and understanding. "Because I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to understand the depth of the problems here," he said calmly. "You're not the only one suffering from this hospital's culture, Sarah. But you've been the one who resisted the most. The one who stood out the most. And that's why I knew you would be essential to the changes I plan to implement." Sarah didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more irritated. On the one hand, someone finally saw her worth, someone who could make real changes. But on the other hand, it was hard to accept that all of this had been some kind of test for John. "So, are you going to intervene? You're going to change things?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. "I'm not just going to intervene," John replied, his voice firm. "I'm going to make a structural change in this hospital. Starting with putting an end to the toxic culture that allows people like Dr. Harris and patients like George Davis to feel entitled to disrespect professionals like you. And I'm going to do it now." Before Sarah could respond, John picked up the phone on the desk and made a direct call. She watched, incredulous, as he requested an immediate meeting with the hospital's board. His voice was calm, but his authority was unquestionable. "Get ready, Sarah," he said, finishing the call. "Things are going to change. And I need you by my side to make sure this change happens." At that moment, Sarah felt a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her was relieved, part of her was nervous. She never imagined she would be put in such a crucial position. But, at the same time, she couldn't deny the growing sense of justice. Maybe, finally, everything she had endured was about to be worth it. John stood up and gestured for her to follow. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity was stronger. As they walked through the hospital corridors, she felt the stares of the other nurses on them. Marta and Dr. Harris were ahead, engaged in a serious conversation, unaware of John and Sarah's approach. "Miller, what are you doing here?" Dr. Harris asked, surprised to see John approaching with Sarah at his side. "What am I doing here?" John repeated with an ironic smile. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here, Dr. Harris? Because from this moment on, things are going to be very different." Marta frowned, confused, but John kept his eyes locked on Dr. Harris. He pulled out his phone, and within minutes, the hospital's conference room was filled with executives, board members, and other doctors. Sarah was invited to sit next to John, as he calmly stood up and began to speak. "I'm here today as the primary shareholder and investor of this hospital," John said, his voice firm and clear. "And as such, I have the responsibility to ensure that St. Luke's General Hospital operates under the highest standards of ethics and respect. Over the past few months, I've observed a toxic culture developing in this hospital. A culture that allows prejudice, discrimination, and ineffective leadership." Murmurs began among the executives, but John paid no attention. He continued. "From now on, that ends. Dr. Harris will be investigated for his inappropriate conduct and discriminatory behavior. The leadership will be restructured. And new inclusive policies will be implemented to ensure that all professionals, regardless of their color, gender, or background, are treated with respect." Sarah looked around, seeing the surprise and, in some cases, discomfort on the faces of the board members. It was clear that no one had expected this. Dr. Harris was pale, speechless. Marta seemed completely bewildered. "And I want everyone to know that Sarah Johnson, one of the best nurses this hospital has ever had, will be a key part of this change. She will lead the new diversity and inclusion programs, ensuring that what happened here never happens again." Sarah's heart raced. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. It was as if the weight she had been carrying was finally being lifted, and a new opportunity was unfolding before her eyes. She, who had faced so much prejudice, was now going to be a key figure in rebuilding a new era for the hospital. "From today onward, things will change," John concluded. "And I guarantee this change starts now." The days following John Miller's intervention were chaotic. St. Luke's General Hospital, which once seemed like a playground for discrimination and prejudice, was now under new leadership, with deep changes being implemented. Sarah could hardly believe how quickly things were happening. The hospital, once dominated by figures like Dr. Harris and a system ingrained with inequality, was now undergoing a revolution. Shortly after the meeting with the board, Sarah was called in for a private conversation with John and the hospital's new management team. She still felt surprised by the proposal to take on a leadership role in the new diversity and inclusion programs. It was a huge responsibility, but also a unique opportunity to make a real difference. When she entered the meeting room, John was there, accompanied by executives she had never seen before. They greeted her with cordial smiles, and John invited her to sit next to him. "Welcome, Sarah," he said, with a smile that mixed satisfaction and expectation. "I know the past few days have been intense, but I'm glad you've accepted to be part of this change." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to control her nerves. Despite all the confidence she had shown in her work so far, this was something entirely new for her. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Miller. But I must admit I'm still trying to process everything," she responded, her voice calmer than she felt inside. John nodded, understanding. "It's natural. Change like this is never easy. But you've already proven that you have the resilience and skills necessary to handle great challenges. That's exactly why we need you here," John said, pausing as he observed her closely. "You know the culture of this hospital better than anyone. You've experienced the prejudice and discrimination that permeates its halls firsthand. And that's why you, more than anyone else, are the right person to ensure that this never happens again." John's words touched Sarah deeply. For a moment, she thought of her mother, Catherine, and all the sacrifices she herself had made throughout her life to get where she was. And now, she stood before the chance to transform not only her own reality but that of every other professional who had faced the same struggles she had. "I accept," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure St. Luke's becomes a place where everyone is respected and treated with dignity." John smiled, satisfied. "I'm glad to hear that. The first step will be to create a diversity committee. You'll lead it and work directly with the management team to implement new policies. We'll review the hiring process, provide mandatory training on inclusion and respect, and investigate any reports of inappropriate behavior fairly and promptly." The following days were a whirlwind. Sarah was officially introduced as the hospital's new Chief of Diversity and Inclusion, a position created especially for her, symbolizing John Miller's commitment to transforming the environment. While many people supported the change, Sarah knew there was also resistance, especially from the older doctors and those, like Dr. Harris, who had benefited from the toxic culture that had existed there. One of Sarah's first actions was to organize a meeting with the nurses and other frontline staff to discuss the changes ahead. As she entered the meeting room, she felt the eyes of everyone on her, some curious, some skeptical, and others clearly hostile. Marta, the head nurse, sat at the back, arms crossed, her face hardened with disapproval. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, trying to keep her tone calm. "As many of you already know, I'm taking the lead on the hospital's new diversity and inclusion programs. I know this is a significant change, but I believe we can all agree that it's a necessary one." Her words floated through the room, met with murmurs. Marta, who had always made her aversion to Sarah clear, was the first to speak up. "And what exactly do these changes mean for us?" Marta asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Is this going to affect how we work?" Sarah knew she would face this kind of resistance. Marta represented the old guard, the mindset that had allowed the hospital's prejudice to persist. But Sarah was ready. "It means we're going to create a workplace where every professional can work without fear of discrimination or unequal treatment," Sarah replied without hesitation. "We'll review hiring processes, ensure that every employee receives training on inclusion and respect, and create an environment where any inappropriate behavior is investigated and dealt with seriously. This will make our workplace fairer, safer, and ultimately more efficient." Marta narrowed her eyes but said nothing more. Other staff members also seemed hesitant, but some began nodding in agreement, as if they were finally grasping the importance of the changes. The tense silence of the room was broken when one of the younger nurses, Lucia, raised her hand. "I think it's a great idea," Lucia said, her voice full of sincerity. "We all know some things here need to change. I've seen incidents of racism and sexism that made me uncomfortable, but I never felt safe enough to speak up. If these new policies can protect us, I think we're moving in the right direction." Supported by Lucia's words, Sarah felt a wave of relief. Things were beginning to move in the right direction, even if there was resistance. Over time, she knew she could win everyone's trust. After the meeting, Sarah was approached by an unexpected figure. Dr. Harris, the senior doctor who had been the main source of her torment in the hospital, stood in the hallway waiting for her. His expression was tense, and he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Johnson." "Sarah," he corrected, as if it was a personal effort. "I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you before. I don't know if it means anything now, but I was wrong." Sarah studied him for a few seconds, unsure if Dr. Harris's words were sincere or just an attempt to save his own reputation. But deep down, she knew the change happening in the hospital was bigger than any apology he could offer. "Thank you for your words, Dr. Harris," Sarah replied calmly. "But what matters now isn't just words. It's actions. I hope that, moving forward, we can work together to create a better environment." Dr. Harris nodded, and for a moment, he truly seemed ashamed. Sarah knew that he, like many others, still had a long way to go, but that in itself was a victory. The simple fact that he was apologizing was a sign that things were changing. When Sarah finally left the hospital that night, the air felt lighter. The transformation had just begun, and she knew there would still be many challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that the future wasn't an endless road of insurmountable obstacles. On her way home, she looked up at the dark sky, the city lights flickering in the distance, and thought of her mother's words, "You'll have to be twice as good as everyone else." But now, Sarah wasn't alone. She was surrounded by people who saw her worth, who believed in her. And with that, she knew she was ready to face any challenge that lay ahead. Months had passed since John Miller's decisive intervention at St. Luke's General Hospital, and the transformation had been rapid and profound. The walls that once seemed to suffocate Sarah with the weight of prejudice now reflected a more inclusive and welcoming environment. The hospital was unrecognizable, not only physically, with new policies being implemented, but also in the way people interacted with one another. Now as Chief of Diversity and Inclusion, Sarah was at the center of it all. Her role went far beyond simple administrative actions. She worked directly with the team, organized workshops on respect and equality, and ensured that everyone, from the lowest to the highest levels of hierarchy, understood what it meant to work in a discrimination-free environment. But the most significant change came when the diversity committee she led began reviewing the history of how staff and patients had been treated. Old cases of discrimination were brought to light, and deep investigations were conducted. For Sarah, it was painful to see how much injustice had been ignored for so long, but she also felt a profound sense of justice knowing that, finally, the victims would be heard. One of the most emblematic cases was that of Dr. Harris. During the investigations, it became clear that his behavior had not only harmed Sarah but many other professionals over the years. Despite his initial attempt to apologize, he was removed from his position, and new medical leadership was established. Sarah knew that this was an important victory. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. It was a clear message that toxic behavior would no longer be tolerated. 6 months later, St. Luke's began to attract international attention. The changes at the hospital became an example of how to restructure an institution deeply rooted in prejudice. Sarah's story, a black woman who faced racism head-on, fought against adversity, and became a leader of historic change, was told by newspapers and television programs worldwide. Sarah was invited to speak at conferences on diversity and inclusion, sharing her experience and the lessons she had learned. Her story inspired hospitals and companies to reconsider their own practices and seek ways to become more just and equal. She had never imagined that her personal struggle could have such a widespread impact, but now it was clear that her journey was far from being just about herself. At one of these conferences, Sarah took the stage before an international audience. Doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, and other healthcare professionals were there to hear her speak. She began by recounting her experience at St. Luke's, from the early days of exclusion and prejudice to the moment John Miller revealed his true power and transformed the hospital. "Many times, we feel alone in our fight," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "But my story is proof that change is possible. No matter how deeply rooted prejudice is in an institution, there is always a way to transform it." And it begins when we refuse to remain silent. Sarah's words were met with enthusiastic applause. For many in the audience, she was a symbol of resilience and leadership, a living example that the impossible could be achieved. As she left the stage, several people approached to thank her for her words, and Sarah felt grateful to be able to impact so many lives. However, despite all the attention and recognition, Sarah never lost sight of what was truly important: the impact within St. Luke's itself. She knew that the fight for equality was ongoing and that the work wasn't done. There was still resistance, still challenges ahead. But as she walked through the hospital corridors now, she saw different faces, brighter smiles, and she felt that the environment was truly changing. Sarah's journey had begun with hardship and adversity, but now she stood as a beacon of hope, not only for herself but for countless others who had faced discrimination. The hospital had been transformed, and so had she. And though the road ahead still had its obstacles, Sarah was confident that the future she had once struggled to imagine was finally within reach. John Miller remained actively involved in the process. He continued to invest in the hospital and support Sarah's initiatives. Despite the initial mystery surrounding his arrival, John had become a powerful and committed ally to the cause. They met frequently to discuss the next steps and how to ensure that the changes they had worked so hard for would become permanent. "You know, Sarah," John said during one of these meetings, "when I first came to this hospital, I knew it would be an enormous challenge. But I never expected to meet someone like you. Someone who didn't just resist the pressure but completely transformed the environment around them. This hospital is what it is today because of you." Sarah smiled, grateful for John's words but also humble. "I didn't do this alone," she responded. "Every person who stood up and fought against prejudice was part of this transformation. And we still have a long way to go." John nodded, knowing she was right. The fight against prejudice never truly ended. It was a continuous effort. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. The Ministry of Health sent a team to visit St. Luke's. They wanted to see firsthand how the hospital had transformed and to understand the inclusion model that Sarah and John had implemented. The visit turned into an even greater opportunity when, after the inspection, the hospital was selected as a model of excellence in diversity policies for other hospitals in the country. The global impact didn't stop there. Other institutions around the world began adapting the principles that Sarah had implemented, creating their own diversity and inclusion structures. The name St. Luke's became synonymous with change, and Sarah Johnson was recognized as a leader in the equality movement within healthcare. That night, as she left the hospital, Sarah felt a fresh breeze in the air. She walked to the bus stop, something she made a point of continuing to do despite all the changes in her life. Success hadn't altered her essence. It was a journey that still challenged her, but this time, she knew she had a team of support by her side, people who believed in the same future she did. While waiting for the bus, a young nurse approached timidly. "Nurse Johnson," the young woman asked, admiration in her eyes. "I just wanted to say that you're an inspiration to me. What you did at the hospital, it gives me hope that things can be different for all of us." Sarah smiled, moved. "I'm so glad to hear that," she said, touched by the young woman's sincerity. "And don't forget, you're part of this change too. We all are." The bus arrived, and Sarah waved to the nurse before getting on. As she sat down, she looked out the window and saw the hospital in the distance. The place that had once been a symbol of her struggles was now the stage for her victories. And more than that, it was a beacon of hope for so many others who, like her, dreamed of a more just future. Finally, Sarah knew she had achieved something much greater than respect. She had helped build a legacy.